All right, so your second section of notes over Vietnam started with the text and the reading Combating Communism in Two Hemispheres. We're going to focus mostly on the communist fight that was taking place in the Eastern Hemisphere in Vietnam, but your textbook does outline what had taken place in Cuba and other areas around Latin America in regards to communism and containment and that whole idea. So specifically in Vietnam, you've got the Viet Cong guerrillas, who are the North Vietnamese fighters, attack a U.S. airbase in the south in February of 1965. And so President Johnson orders retaliatory bombing against North Vietnam. And so this is the first time that U.S. troops had been ordered to land and attack in the north. And so by March of 1965, the U.S. had initiated what was called Operation Rolling Thunder, where it was regular full-scale bombing against North Vietnam. And so by the end of that year, in 1965, the United States had committed 184,000 troops to fighting in Vietnam. And as the United States increased its troop counts, so did the North Vietnamese. And so it was increasingly becoming an American war. The South Vietnamese were just standing by and kind of watching. And then fast forward a few years later, by 1968, the United States troops levels were sitting at 500,000, and the annual bill of the war was costing us $30 billion. Despite this, there was not an end anywhere in sight. And so that foreshadows what this means for Johnson in a couple of years. And actually, to go back a little bit, Johnson had become president because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, who had kind of started or continued our involvement that Eisenhower had started with the Vietnam War. So that was the conclusion of the first section of reading you guys had. The second section was a little bit longer, Vietnam Vexations. And so America was struggling to defeat the enemy in North Vietnam, but was doing a good job of kind of tearing itself apart, defeating itself, because you had the worldwide reaction to this world superpower attacking really a third world country and bombing a third world country in North Vietnam. And so around the world, they're kind of condemning the United States for those actions. And then even within the United States itself, you've got the domestic discontent over what's taking place in Vietnam. You have anti-war demonstrations. You have teach-ins where professors are and people are educating the public on what they think and what is actually taking place in Vietnam. You've got a protest of the U.S. military draft that's pulling in more and more unwilling participants in this conflict. And so you have thousands and thousands of draft registrants fleeing to Canada, others burning draft cards. If you know who Muhammad Ali is, he was Cassius Clay at the time, but he was a boxer, heavyweight title holder, probably the most famous of these draft registrants to flee to Canada. And he actually had his title weight belt stripped from him, and he was unwilling to fight because of his religious beliefs. And so if you know the story of Muhammad Ali, this is the conflict where his speaking out against what he saw in society, it's where this started. So you've even got opposition within Congress. We've got around the world, we've got the American public, and then Congress opposes Vietnam as well. You've got Senator William Fulbright in the Committee on Foreign Relations, who is questioning what's going on in Vietnam. And so this starts to develop when you have people within the government themselves questioning what's taking place in Vietnam. You have a credibility gap starting to open up. And we're going to see this not only through the rest of Johnson's administration, but in Nixon's as well, where there's a gap between what the government is saying and what the people are believing. And then even within the Johnson administration itself, they're bickering about, are we doing the right thing in Vietnam? And the defense secretary, who we mentioned previously, who had established the idea of flexible response, Secretary McNamara, expressed increasing discomfort at events, and he was kind of quietly moved out of his position after he did that. And so by 1968, the Vietnam War had become the longest and most unpopular war in U.S. history, because we've been fighting this since, involved in this since 1954. And so the government had failed at multiple levels, but one of those levels was explaining to the American people what was actually at stake in Vietnam. And so by 1968, your casualty count is already sitting at over 100,000. And so that leads then into the evidence that the Americans had been trapped in an Asian Civil War. Despite this, Johnson continues to keep the strategy of flexible response and ratcheting up the United States' involvement in the conflict. And he even comes out to the American public and says he sees light at the end of the tunnel. This is in 1968, and we'll see here over the next sections of notes when the war actually ends. But because of this and the credibility gap, more and more Americans feel like Johnson was going to save Vietnam simply by destroying it. And so this leads us to Johnson's downfall. In January of 1968, after Johnson has said that there is light at the end of the tunnel, the Viet Cong launch the Tet Offensive, and it's known as the Tet Offensive because Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and this is when the attack was launched. And so the Viet Cong launched a coordinated attack on 27 cities in South Vietnam, including the capital city of Saigon. And so what this shows is if the enemy truly is retreating and is in a position of weakness, they would not be able to launch a coordinated attack like this. Ultimately, U.S. forces and South Vietnamese forces do defeat the Viet Cong in this attack, but it's a political victory for the Viet Cong because it shows that they are nowhere near being done with the conflict. And so Johnson has to wear this, and even personally, he is agonizing over the lives that are lost because of orders he's given to continue to fight in Vietnam. Despite this, the order to increase troop levels by more than 200,000 is put into Congress. And so this request is put in, and this is an election year, 1968. And so Johnson is facing competition within his own party. So within the Democratic Party, you have McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, who are mounting a formidable opposition to him within his own party. So not even talking about the general election, Democrats and Republicans. Within the Democratic Party, you have three strong candidates, Johnson, McCarthy, and Kennedy. And so on March 31st, 1968, Johnson goes on television and makes two announcements. One is he's going to freeze troop levels, and the other is he's going to scale back bombing. And lastly, he is going to not run for president in the 1968 election. So that does a couple of things. One, it says that we are going to continue fighting because we're not withdrawing troops, we're freezing them. We are going to pull back the bombing, so you're appeasing war hawks and war doves. And then he says, I'm not going to run for president, despite the fact he was eligible in 1968, which is going to open the door for McCarthy or Kennedy, both of who are war doves. And so we'll pick up on the election of 1968 with our next section of notes.